This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by the sons of Union veterans of the Civil War. The Naval War tends to be an underappreciated part of the U.S. Civil War, especially as important as the Navy was to the Union's Anaconda Plan to economically and militarily strangle the South via blockade. And inasmuch as the Naval War is lesser appreciated, the Naval War in the West on the Mississippi River and its tributaries is even more underappreciated. And even as much attention we pay to that so-called brown water navy on the Mississippi, most of the attention tends to go to the big ironclads. But the unsung heroes of the Civil War along the Mississippi aren't the casemate ironclads of the city class, but rather a much larger fleet of much smaller and more lightly armored vessels that are nearly forgotten today. The Tinclads of the U.S. Civil War deserve to be remembered. Are you looking for a deeper connection to Civil War history and to make an impact on your community? The Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War is a congressionally chartered 501c3 charitable fraternal organization dedicated to preserving the memory of the heroes who fought to save the Union and end slavery in America. From their powerful bonds of brotherhood to their rich traditions and rituals, they offer community impact, personal growth, fellowship and networking, and family involvement in a welcoming third space. Whether you're a descendant or simply inspired by their legacy, you'll find brotherhood, purpose, and tradition with the SUVCW. Join a community built on fraternity, charity, and loyalty. Visit www.suvcw.org or email join@suvcw.com to learn more. When the Confederates first fired on Fort Sumter, the commanding general of the United States Army, Winfield Scott, a veteran of the War of 1812, was nearly 75 years old. He would resign as commanding general before the end of 1861. But the venerable and by then rotund veteran left the Union with a plan that would ultimately win the war: the Anaconda Plan. Scott enunciated the plan to George B. McClellan, then a major general of volunteers. He wrote in the letter, "We rely greatly on the sure operation of a complete blockade of the Atlantic and Gulf ports soon to commence. In connection with such blockade, we propose a powerful movement down the Mississippi to the ocean, with a cordon of posts at proper points, and the capture of Forts Jackson and St. Philip, the object being to clear out and keep open this great line of communication in connection with the strict blockade of the seaboard, so as to develop the insurgent states and bring them to terms with less bloodshed than by any other plan." Scott didn't coin the term Anaconda Plan. That was actually a name derisively coined by opponents who wanted a more aggressive strategy, likening the plan to the slow suffocation caused by the South American reptile. But the vision of early and easy victory was quickly dashed by defeat at First Manassas, and the Union steeled itself for a prolonged conflict. Although the Federal Navy was far larger than the fledgling Confederate Navy, it was an enormous challenge to blockade 12 major Confederate ports and some 3,500 miles of Atlantic and Gulf coastline. But the plan to hold the Great Line of Communication, the Mississippi and its tributaries, the Cumberland, Ohio, and Tennessee, required a riverine force, a so-called brown water navy. The Navy had no such fleet, although there was an idea. Only weeks after the firing on Fort Sumter, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles received correspondence from St. Louis engineer James B. Eads, suggesting specifications for retrofitting snag boats, a type of steamer typically used to clear river obstructions, to serve as gunboats in shallower, narrower river waters. Tim Palooka writes in the Journal of the Material Research Society in 2017, "Though railroads were growing quickly, the rivers were still the quickest way to transport troops, equipment, and food. Both sides purchased riverboats with shallow drafts to navigate rivers that, at the time, dropped to depths of a couple of feet in the hot summer months." Oddly, it wasn't even clear that the inland rivers were the responsibility of the Navy. The Battlefield Trust continues, Wells, believing that interior waterways were the jurisdiction of the Army rather than Navy, passed a suggestion on to the War Department. Intrigued, officials there requested that naval procurers and constructors be sent west. With the blessing of Major General George B. McClellan, commanding the Army's Department of the Ohio, 3 steamers were soon procured at shipyards in Pittsburgh, and Wells ceded their movements to the control of the Army. The result of Eads' plan was a strange command structure. A naval officer, Captain Andrew Hull Foote, was dispatched to the West to command naval operations, but he would answer not to the Navy, but to the Army. The Trust explains, despite receiving orders from the Army, Foote and the Navy were responsible for fitting out the vessels and manning them, recruiting experienced sailors from among riverboat crews and the shipping industry on the Great Lakes. The initial 3 sidewheel steamers that were acquired and outfitted were the Conestoga, the Lexington, and the Tyler. The boats were outfitted with cannon that would allow them to bombard shore installations and fight off Confederate naval threats. But they were also armored. Palooka writes, steam-powered paddle-wheel boats had to be outfitted for protection from enemy cannon fire and rifle fire. Through experimentation in 1861, Union Commander John Rogers II determined that 5 inches of oak timber was sufficient to protect sailors from the penetration of a rifle bullet shot from a guerrilla sniper on the riverbank. These vessels, with their thick wooden armor, were called timberclads. Technical writer Mitch Williamson writes in the 2018 edition of warhistory.org, protected by 5-inch timber bulwarks, they were, as one officer remarked, unprotected against anything more formidable than musketry. The lightly armored timberclads were typically used to escort Union supply ships. Meanwhile, the American Battlefield Trust writes, the War Department had commissioned Eads to construct 7 ironclad gunboats. These crafts, 175 feet long and drawing only 6 feet of water, were not completely encased in metal, but had 2.5-inch thick plates covering the bow and stern paddle wheel, as well as on the sides, covering the machinery. Each was heavily manned, with a combination of 8-inch guns and 12, 32, and 42-pound rifles. While the ironclad gunboats, called the City class, were powerful, the guns of the timberclads joined them when concentrated naval fire was needed. Williamson writes, these ungainly-looking timberclads proved their worth at the Battle of Belmont and continued to serve the flotilla at Forts Henry and Donelson, during the Battle of Shiloh, on the Yazoo River and in the lower Mississippi. In fact, a 4th timberclad, USS Essex, formerly the snagboat New Era and later renamed Essex after a Navy sailing frigate from the War of 1812, was first built as a timberclad where the boat served on the Cumberland River. Essex Captain David Porter, some of the man who had captained the original Essex, had the boat modified by adding 3 inches of iron armor. Williamson writes that the most formidable ironclad in the Mississippi Squadron was the Essex. The Union fleet on the western rivers, still under the Army but with crews from the Navy, was called the Western Gunboat Flotilla. To oppose them, the Confederate States acquired and armed a handful of merchant vessels, which were organized into what was then called the River Defense Fleet. These 14 vessels were armored with a mix of wood and bales of compressed cotton, which would absorb enemy fire, held together with iron strips. The bricolaged vessels were called cottonclads. While the cottonclads were innovative, making use of sharpshooters as the Confederate access to large guns was limited, the River Defense Fleet was small and poorly organized. The crews were most often civilian. The Confederate fleet was destroyed by the Western Gunboat Flotilla in the June 6, 1862 Battle of Memphis. But this would give rise to a new type of warfare and the need for a new class of vessel. Richard Goodmestad, a professor of history at Colorado State University, explains in a 2020 edition of the journal The Conversation, an irregular guerrilla war was an improvisation that began in earnest in the summer of 1862. By that point, Union ironclads and speedy rams had squashed the measly Confederate River Defense Fleet at Memphis. As Northern armies began to march overland towards Vicksburg and elsewhere, they depended on steamboats for supplies. The Confederates created mobile ambush squads that were conglomerations of artillery and cavalry and sent them to the shores of the Mississippi River and its tributaries to attack Union supply boats and the ironclad gunboats that protected them. Palooka writes, the ever-increasing guerrilla fighting of Confederate snipers soon called for a more formidable response. Rear Admiral Charles H. Davis, commander of the Western Flotilla, pushed for the development of lighter riverboats clad in 1/2 to 1-inch thick layers of iron for protection. These new vessels, with lighter armor, were called Tinclads. While not literally armored with tin, the name referred to their limited armor as opposed to the more heavily armored ironclads. Goodmestad explains, Union commanders realized that their ironclads clustered their men into a few boats, so they improvised and created a fleet of tinclads, also known as mosquitoes. These boats were lightly armored, had a crew of about 70 men, carried 6 to 8 light cannons, and could go just about anywhere because they had a draft of 30 inches of water. Lester Swift of the Western Reserve Historical Society wrote in a 1961 edition of the journal Civil War History, The Mississippi Squadron was a very heterogeneous collection of vessels, hardly any two of them alike. The great majority were typical riverboats, which had formerly been used for freight and passenger service and were altered by mounting steel plates on the sides to give the crew some protection against sharpshooters. The first of the Tinclads was actually completed in June 1862, converted from the stern-wheel steamer Alfred Robb, which had been used as a Confederate transport and had been captured in April 1862. Like the timberclads, the Tinclads were converted vessels rather than purpose-constructed. While better protected than the timberclads, Arthur K. M. Alexander explains in 2017, keep in mind that this tin sheeting wasn't useful while under fire by heavy artillery. It was chosen to protect against small arms. Williamson describes their service. The little gunboats dubbed Tinclads were not yet in service and thus did not take part in the battles for New Orleans or Memphis or in the engagements with the ironclad CSS Arkansas. But they made valuable contributions to Union naval operations on the Mississippi, Ohio, Tennessee, Cumberland, Yazoo, and Red Rivers. Designed to patrol shallow, twisting western rivers, they were converted from steamboats by the addition of thin boilerplate iron as armor. Although they are rarely mentioned in the context of the war, possibly because the Confederate Navy had largely been eliminated on the western rivers before they saw service, the Tinclads were actually the most numerous vessels used by the Union in the West, which in October of 1862 was officially transferred to the Navy and renamed the Mississippi River Squadron. The ironclads, as well as the timberclads and tinclads, were used to attack and bombard Confederate defenses in the campaign in the West. The tin-clad USS Memora was on hand to rescue the crew of the City-class ironclad USS Cairo when it struck two underwater mines and sunk in December 1862. According to the website of Vicksburg National Military Park, members of Memora's crew played a crucial role in the battle fought near the Yazoo River on March 5, 1864, when the ship's 12-pounder howitzer gun was deployed ashore, making a vital contribution to the narrow Union victory. 3 members of the howitzer's gun crew received the Medal of Honor for their valor that day. One of those, Samuel Bartlett Laffey, was the namesake of a World War II destroyer that is the subject of another episode of the History Guy. But the more extensive service for the Tinclads was the vital role protecting Union transport and supply under constant threat from Confederate guerrillas. Gunstadt writes, "The crews of the Tinclads and the other gunboats waged a deadly game of whack-a-mole along the western rivers. Wherever rebels popped up and attacked a boat, the fleet tried to spite it. As a Civil War historian who has been researching the Union's river navy for 7 years, I have learned that the fleet was important in ways beyond its attacks on southern forts. It protected Union transports and supply boats from Confederate ambushes. In the process, the Union Navy waged a nasty war against Southerners who supported the insurgents." Swift explains, the Union Navy on inland waters during the Civil War did not take part in any major engagements after the fall of Vicksburg, but the sailor on a tinclad was probably shot at more often than the average infantryman. The men in the Mississippi River Squadron were forced to eat as much wormy food, ran as much greater risk of getting malaria, and could be killed just as dead as the soldiers fighting in the trenches at Petersburg. Roland Stafford True, a sailor aboard USS Silver Lake, wrote, "One day living peacefully at anchor, and the next one on some expedition up or down the river. Up the Cumberland today, up the Tennessee tomorrow, down the Mississippi the next, here and there and wherever needed." Swift was the grandson of John Swift, who left Liverpool, England in June 1863 and enlisted in the U.S. Navy at Cleveland early the following month. He was sent to the naval base at Cairo, Illinois, for service with the Mississippi Squadron. He was made a paymaster aboard the Federal tinclad USS Silver Cloud. Swift explains, during the summer of 1863, conditions in Tennessee were chaotic. Portions of the state could be reached easily by Union gunboats. Admiral D.D. Porter dispatched into the state gunboats, whose primary mission was to drive away or capture detachments from the Confederate Army in the Tennessee River area, who were forcing pro-Union men to join the Confederate service. Of the men they were fighting, Swift wrote his sister in Liverpool, "Tell Maggie that if she saw a few of her darling Southerners, she would be so disgusted that she'd commit suicide right away. They wear no uniforms, but turn out in straw or felt hats. They wear old trousers or woolen or coarse white shirts, and as to their faces, they have the most diabolical, unshaven countenances that you can imagine." Of the women he encountered, "I see white women here pretty often, but they are almost invariably ugly, badly made, and they have a peculiarly hard, worldly, money-making look in their faces, that they seem to say, 'You can't chisel me, my boy.'" Swift gives a fascinating insight into the life aboard a tinclad of the Mississippi Squadron, writing to his brother-in-law, At 5:30 a.m., summer or winter, you turn out dress and lash up your hammock and take it to the hammock netting. If this is not done in 7 minutes from the time of all hands are called, you are put on the blacklist, which means being kept constantly at work for a week or more. After you've stowed away your hammock, you can do what you please until 6 o'clock, when breakfast is piped. The said breakfast consists of colored hot water, facetiously called coffee, and hard biscuits. At 6:45, all hands are turned to scrub and holystoke decks. This being a very important part of the ship's duties, generally lasts till about 9 o'clock. After decks are all clean, there are a few spare moments generally employed by the men in cleaning themselves, and at 9:30 the drum beats to quarters for inspection and drill. Every man runs to his station. The officer of the division sees that all his men are present and then reports all present to the executive officer, who in turn reports to the captain. The executive then comes below and inspects each gun's crew to see that they are properly dressed and are clean. If a man is discovered to be dirty, he is taken that evening and made to strip himself entirely. The hose is got out, the pump manned, 5 or 6 men stand by with scrubbing brushes and a bucket of sand, and then he is washed and scrubbed. A man once washed so is always very careful to keep himself very clean afterwards. Dinner, he wrote, consisted of more colored water and hardtack. He lists many of the expected complaints: poor food, mosquitoes and cockroaches, an unpopular captain, frozen sentry duty in winter, but also mentions the risk of combat. We went up White River last time as far as any gunboat has been before, but it got too hot for us, and we had to return, the rebs being as thick as peas everywhere. A fellow dare not show his nose. On March 6, 1865, he wrote of being wounded. A guerrilla tried a shot at me this morning and cut the leg of my never-mind-whats and spoiled their appearance considerable, as well as taking a small rip out of my poor thigh. I made him a bow and got out of sight quick, or in naval parlance, I laid low. The wound was apparently not as serious as it sounds, as he makes no mention of treatment. He also expresses the frustration of the duty. There are no rebs here, only a few guerrillas, and they, being in small bands from 20 to 100, keep out of our way very carefully. 26 of them, however, behaved rather boldly the other night. They came down on a plantation, secured the inhabitants, and carried off all the cotton. This was done under our very noses, as we lay at anchor right opposite the plantation that night, and never knew anything of the affair till morning, when the plantation folks told us. I guess we'll catch the fellows yet, and make things hot for them. The ability to strike and fade away made hunting the insurgents difficult. Gudmestad writes, the reactive strategy failed because rebels could quickly retreat into the southern countryside, and so Admiral David Dixon Porter devised a new strategy. He gave Union commanders the authority to confiscate or destroy civilian property, including food, animals, cotton, buildings, and personal property. Porter intended to starve rebels by depriving their men and horses of food. He also hoped to inflict enough punishment on civilians that they would withdraw their support for the insurgents. That order, he writes, would turn into all sorts of plunder, but, he notes, the strategy of exhaustion produced indifferent results. The Mississippi River Squadron was not able to quash resistance. Many civilians stayed loyal to the Confederacy and supported guerrillas until the war ended. Still, Palooka writes, in 3 years of fighting, only 3 of these swift, shallow-bottomed tinclads were lost in battle. They often accompanied larger gunboats, protect them from riverside sniping, and greatly reduced the damage inflicted by Confederate guerrillas for the remainder of the war. And Gudmestad writes, since the boats only patrolled the water, they could not occupy the land and drive out the rebels. But the river navy provided enough protection to Union supply lines to ensure victory over the Confederate army. The Union's Mississippi River Squadron didn't have to win its war. It merely had to prevent the rebels from winning theirs. The Tinclads played a unique role in the U.S. Civil War. Williamson compared them to the role played by the Navy swift boats that patrolled the Mekong Delta during the Vietnam conflict. And while the Tinclads played a role in the war that was far from romantic and almost forgotten in the broader context of the war, they were surprisingly effective. Palooka notes that while ultimately the Union victory was the result of land battles, the superior number of soldiers, and greater resources of the Union, the riverboats, clad in all manner of material, had a key role in the outcome of the U.S. Civil War. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.